This is a roast of a sample of beans that I rediscovered in my freezer. These are beans that I froze in 2014. It's a sample from a village in Kintamani, Bali that I worked with back in 2014, 2015 to build a wet mill on the property of one of the farmers. So these beans have a bit of meaning to me. This was the harvest before we had the wet mill built. The wet mill was built at the end of 2014 and was ready for harvest season 2015. I did a roast of these yesterday, and the roast was a failure because I inadvertently left some settings on in Artisan that enabled playback and automation. Basically, I was letting Artisan control the roast based on the background profile that I have loaded here, which is the most recent roast I did of these same beans from a few years ago. And Artisan wasn't doing a very good job, for whatever reason, of matching the background roast. It could be that the background roast was running on a previous version of Artisan and the commands weren't coming through properly. I'm just not sure. I'd have to dig into that some more. I have in my roast flow, I have the fan largely automated, so it just after the drying phase the fan will turn on, and then just before first crack it will increase. And I largely just let Artisan control the fan so that I can worry about temperature control and other things. There may be times when I turn the fan on for various reasons, to pull heat out of the drum, or if there's a specific bean that's smoking more than normal, nearing first crack, I'll turn the fan on to just extract more of that smoke so that I don't taste it in the coffee. But by and large, I let Artisan control the fan, and I've built the alarms in Artisan to pretty much mimic the Diedrich roaster, because that's what I have most of my roasting time on, is the Diedrich, and it only has 3 settings. It's the first setting is 80% pulling through the cooling tray, 20% pulling through the drum, and then you can go to 50-50, and then you can switch it to 80% through the drum, 20% through the tray. So you basically have 3 fan settings on the Diedrich, and I've pretty much mimicked that within Artisan. And you can see that just happened here. I just crossed out of the first phase at 300 degrees Fahrenheit at the bean temperature, and I kicked the fan on up to 50%. Now I did it in 2 steps simply because I didn't want to greatly impact the rate of change or the rate of rise. And I'm also going to start backing off the heat already. And I'm doing this so that I can work to avoid the flick and crash. And the controls are looking good. Like I said last time I did this roast yesterday, I was fighting with Artisan because I had settings set incorrectly. And in keeping an eye on it on this roast, it's looking good. It looks like that was the problem. Previously I had run a roast to test the full playback features of Artisan, where it would completely control a roast based on a previous roast's settings. And it appears that within Artisan it works best when both roasts were done with the same or nearly the same version of Artisan. And I had a years old profile loaded in the background. And again, I'm just backing this heat off gently now to stretch out the Maillard phase, the second phase, and also to avoid the flick and crash. So the flick is caused by too much momentum, and when the beans go exothermic, there's an exothermic flash, usually around the cracks, so usually around first crack, second crack. And when that happens, you get a bump in temperature. And according to Scott Rao's theory, that bump in temperature you can taste as kind of a baked taste. And in my experience with this size load that I put in at 130 grams, I want to get down to about 60-65% on the hot top, because any lower than 60 or 65% I begin extracting more heat out of the drum with the fan on high, then the heating element is able to heat up. So I'm able to pull out too much heat, and I risk flattening or dropping the rate of rise. So our fan just bumped up to 75% automatically in preparation for second crack. And again, that's just a rule I have set based on bean temperature and time. I'm now going to start decreasing the heat more aggressively. And that's just to get my power down to 60 or 65 before first crack, which is at this point imminent. There was a pop there. And another pop. We'll call that first crack. 384. This is a relatively slow roast. I probably deadened the Maillard phase a bit too much. First crack in 10 minutes is too late usually. You want to see that about 8.5, 9 minutes. So it'll be interesting to see how this bean reacts. I also dropped at a lower temperature than normal. I dropped at 390. I normally drop at 400. And I changed it because number one, these beans were frozen, and number two, because I have a slightly lighter charge than normal. I only have 128 grams in this one because that's all I have left in the sample. Now my goal here is simply not to flatline this delta BT. This is the measure of the rate of change over here, the rate of rise. And I don't want that to flatten because that creates the baked flavors. And I'm getting close to flatlining it. I need to be careful. I'm going to gently add in some more heat. You see what's happened now is my fan is at 90, my power was at 55, so I was probably extracting too much heat. There we go. That +3 might have gotten us into a good space. Getting a fair amount of smoke coming out of the door there now. So I'm just ramping the fan up a bit. And I'm going to eject it now. Before we get into the post-roast analysis, I just wanted to touch on a couple of things. First of all, these beans are very old. They're from 2014. They were part of an experiment that I've been doing ongoing, where I freeze beans to see if that can extend their life somewhat. And so these beans were part of that experiment, and I'll have a separate video to talk about that. But the short of it is they were hermetically sealed. They were vacuum packed in regular food bags and then stuck in the freezer and left there until it was time to roast them. And then I thaw them out slowly. I go from the freezer to the fridge to the countertop, and give them several days to thaw out so that I don't shock the beans in any way with massive temperature changes coming from the freezer. The second thing I wanted to talk about is early in the video I talked about a previous failed roast, and that roast failed because I left some settings checked within Artisan that would allow playback in Artisan, and I didn't know what was going on at the time, exactly what was causing the problems, but now looking back I can see that 4 years ago I was roasting without the HTRI, or the hot top roaster interface, which is an Arduino based chip that I have installed in the roaster that allows Artisan software to control the roaster. So my previous settings, if I look within the profile, my settings would be something like power 5 or power 6 and fan 1 or fan 2, and that's because the hot top control panel that I use only provided 10% increments for changes in power and fan. So my power settings would be power 5 or power 6, and I was noting those back in the day within Artisan with just buttons that created events on the profile. So my roasting looked like change the setting here at the roaster and then click on a button in Artisan to set the power, to note that the power was set at 50%, for example. So as I was going through the roast the other day, forgetting that I had playback installed and running a very old profile in the background, the profile did indeed say power 6 at this point. Artisan saw that and it sent power 6 through the HTRI to the roaster. The old way meant power 6 meant power 60%, but it was lost in translation. So nothing was wrong with Artisan software, and nothing was wrong with the roaster. It's just that I had forgotten that I left playback on from a previous experiment that I was doing. And also I was using a very old roast profile that had events tagged for an old way of roasting with a hot top. So keeping those two things in mind, let's take a look and see how the roast did. All right, a real quick post-roast analysis, because this video is already getting too long. I wanted to note a couple things. I'm going to hit T to bring up the crosshairs. First thing to note, this is what I was talking about, this P10, P5, and P8 earlier, where the wrong settings were being conveyed through to the roaster. So that's what it looks like here. Another thing I wanted to note is this P10 here. At the time, 4 years ago, I was reading a lot of Willem Booth's stuff in Roast Magazine. And one of the things he used to say, I don't know if he still does or not, but one of the things he used to say was, immediately after first crack, the operator should increase heat in order to regain control of the roast. That may conflict with Scott Rao's notion that the rate of rise should always decrease. The only way those two statements can coincide with each other without conflict is if you follow Willem Booth's advice and you increase power, you don't do it at 100% like I did here. You'll see, I'll point out in the most recent roast of Boolean, I did increase power by 3%, not 100%. And I did not significantly impact the rate of rise. So for Willem Booth's advice to increase the heat post first crack, and for Scott Rao's statement that the rate of rise should always steadily decrease, you have to be careful. It's just a balancing act. So now I'm going to hit Command W and bring the most recent roast into the foreground here. I want to note a couple things. First, this second phase, the Maillard phase, is long for me. 4 minutes and 53 seconds is pretty long. I like to keep that around 4 minutes. Almost 5 minutes is pretty long. And I think that part of the reason why that stretched out so long, number one, is because I made these 3 power changes, decreasing the power before the 401 mark at the environment temperature. And then I start to pull back the power more and more gradually before first crack. This was an attempt to reduce momentum and kind of reduce these 2 exothermic flashes. The other thing I want to note is that I dropped at a lower temperature, and that would probably also impact the length of the second phase. I dropped at a lower temperature because these were frozen beans, and also because I had a slightly smaller charge weight. I normally charge at 130 grams, and this charge weight was 128 grams because that was the end of this sample. Now the cupping notes on this coffee, this is a spider graph that you can generate within Artisan, and you can see that it's pretty monotone, it's pretty one-dimensional. Nothing really stood out as far as the profile is concerned. Also not reflected within this graph, but worth noting, is that the flavor profile of this coffee, as well as the aromatic profile, were dominated by sugar browning flavors and aromas. And that's likely a result of having nearly a 5-minute Maillard phase in the roast profile. This coffee wasn't overly complex to begin with. I looked back at my cupping notes from 2014 when I did the benchmark roast, and there were some pleasant floral and fruity aromas, but they weren't dominant, and the coffee even back then was one-dimensional. And again, the dominance of the sugar browning flavors and aroma is partly caused by this extended Maillard phase or second phase, but also we know that freezing the coffees kind of reduces the complexity and especially impacts those enzymatic flavors. So I'm really happy that this rate of rise declined a little bit better than in 2014. And I just wish that I had more coffees to continue to experiment with this, because I think that this was a big part of my success, was making these changes leading up to the 401 event at the environment temperature. So I hope you like this roast and the post-roast analysis. And as always, please leave me a comment. Let me know what you thought about it. Let me know certain things you wanted to see. I did have somebody recently ask to actually see the beans after the roast. I will work on doing that in the future. I brewed them all in this experiment before I saw that comment. So I used them all up, and I don't have any pictures or video of the beans afterwards. But I'll work on that in the future. And also remember to subscribe to the video so that you know when new videos come out, and I look forward to hearing from you.